Okay, welcome to our March book club, A Swim in the Pond in the Rain. I told James I had to take a walk through the parking lot in the sleet today. I was not expecting snow and sleet today. That was a not that happy surprise, but here we are. So let's talk.
Yeah. You want me to say something, I suppose? Okay. Well, what did you think? I know this is not a book that is a sort of normal book club kind of book, but it just felt like there was so much in it that was worthwhile, to say nothing of the fact of either reading for the first time or rereading some of these wonderful stories, that it just felt like a great kind of, and there's something about reading a book of Russian short stories in the midwinter that just feels right. You know, it's just so. But I wanted to actually point out an odd thing that. Well, I mean, I love many things about this book, but I wanted to point out in Saunders's first afterthought. The book is structured with a story and then an essay and then an afterthought in each case. And in afterthought number 1 on page 61, well, I have a reader's copy. I'm assuming it's still page 61. He writes about the film Bicycle Thieves, Vittorio De Sica's wonderful movie from the 1940s. And it made me realize, I mean, he writes just about a page about his class watching that particular sequence over and over again. And it made me think about, since a lot of the people in this group are, say, over 50, many of you probably grew up watching all the great mid to late mid-century European filmmakers, because their films came over to America and were shown in movie theaters. But that's a particular one. It's either sometimes called The Bicycle Thief, or Saunders calls it Bicycle Thieves, which you've also seen. But if you haven't ever seen that movie, you should track it down, because it's an extraordinary simple film, and it's very much of a piece with these stories, which almost all of them are quite simple and straightforward, and frequently about people who aren't very elevated in society, which is one of the things that makes them so potent, I would argue. And that particular movie by De Sica is very much about, a father and a son living sort of on the edge of life in Rome after World War II, and it's just a very potent thing. But it's a good example of how so many things are connected. In the newsletter today, I wrote briefly about my dear friend Greg Anderson and this class that he has put together at the theater that I used to run, and it's a fabulous class, because it really kind of takes all of the different impulses in art and shows how they're connected. And I used to own an art movie theater in the 80s, and in Connecticut, and it's just I spent so much time in my life watching these kind of movies that were written. They're not visually arresting. It's really about the ideas. And I think that's one of the great things about this book in relation to the writing, is that the stories that Saunders picked, most of them are anything but showy. They're just very direct, simple stories. And it's a fabulous reminder that, as he says at one point, that, I think it's in the introduction. Oh yeah, here it is. The resistance in the story, once we begin reading the stories, which are for the most part quiet, domestic, and apolitical, this idea may strike you as strange. And part of that is because what he's talking about the idea, but he says, but this is a resistance literature written by progressive reformers in a repressive culture under constant threat of censorship in a time when a writer's politics could lead to exile, imprisonment, and execution. The resistance in the stories is quiet, at a slant, and comes from perhaps the most radical idea of all, that every human being is worthy of attention. And that the origins of every good and evil capability of the universe may be found by observing a single, even very humble person and the turnings of his or her mind. And I just, you know, I rarely get angry or frustrated with people, you know, at least, you know, people in the common sense. I reserve my frustrations for certain very small group of people, mostly political. But but what I really love and get just feel sad about is when people say, oh, these, you know, these Russian stories or Chekhov or is a playwright, you know, his play, nothing happens in his plays. And I just feel like if you read this book and you read the way Saunders takes you through these stories, and it's always very, you know, his voice is calm and encouraging, which is great. And the stories reveal themselves very slowly until you get to that last amazing Tolstoy story, which is all of 6 pages long. And it's just astonishing. You know, I mean, I hadn't read that story in years. And I just read it. You know, it was the only one I hadn't read because I've been doing another project and I'm in the middle of a complicated thing right now. But so I squeezed it in last night at 11 o'clock. And I just was, I mean, I was in tears at the end and then read Saunders's brilliant analysis of it where he's kind of really puzzling over the story. And I just thought, God, that's such a healthy way to take readers through it or writers through it or students through it, is to just let you know it's, you know, these stories are intended frequently in their ambiguity to make you really puzzle over why people do what they do, and therefore puzzle over, why do I do what I do? Why do I do that thing? Why do I dismiss that person? Why do I see somebody on the street and assume that that person is, you know, gonna yell at me or whatever? Anything you can think of about your own behavior. It's just so I just feel like this book is a kind of master class on reading and on engaging the world. You know, letting the world in without judging it before it gets into you.
You know, the thing that really struck me, I didn't read every bit, but after reading his first introduction on how to read a short story, I will never, ever approach a short story again in the same way. I mean, it simply wakened up an alertness. I mean, I'm not a big short story fan, but after reading that, I will now approach short stories with a different sort of way of looking at them and an interest. I just thought it was fabulous.
Oh, that's great. Well, see, and that's the gift. There it is. You know, you don't have to read the story. Just throw the book out now. You've gotten what you need. So does anyone want to be brave enough to say which story did you like best or dislike the best? Dislike the best. Is there a story that one of you really loved, or anybody want to say something, talk about that? Or were they all boring? And, you know, I don't know.
My favorite story was The Darling by Chekhov. I've always enjoyed his plays, how they go between comedy and tragedy. And I don't know that I've read his short stories. And that was the one that reminded me the most of his plays with her first husband, who was always complaining about everything. And then the pattern in there of what happened, I thought was very funny as well as serious.
Yeah. Oh, great. And did what Saunders wrote about it afterwards, was it useful or was it?
Yes, it reminded me of a long time ago when I was at UW and I took like 3 classes of comparative literature, and it was fun. I felt like I was back in that class to have someone who is brilliantly analyzing things and discussing it and makes you kind of want to go back and reread them because you don't get everything on the first read through.
Right, right.
And I couldn't, you know, it's interesting. I was thinking about the stories. I didn't completely finish the book. I'm almost there and I will finish it. It's not as if I can just pick one out and say, oh my goodness, I loved that story. Because I liked each one of them for a different reason. And reading Saunders, his input afterwards, like if I didn't understand a story, say for instance, I had a hard time with, I want to call it The Man in the Mirror. That's Michael Jackson, The Man and Vasily and Nikita, who, when Vasily dies at the end.
Master and Man.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Completely wrong title. Anyway, I read that the first time and I just kind of, I don't know. I kind of could figure out where this was going because each chapter, each story made it easier to take what I learned from Saunders, the previous story, and then apply it to the next one. So I felt like I was getting this cumulative education. But after I read his description of that story, I actually kind of went back in a few places and reread spots and went, oh, all right, now I get the story and I kind of like it. Where I didn't dislike it at first, but okay. So it was just so helpful to break down what was happening and understand why. And like you said, then apply it to myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, great. Yeah, and I think it's really useful if you find yourself not responding to a story to say, why isn't this penetrating me? Why am I resisting this story? And some stories obviously are easy to resist. Some stories they just don't speak to you, which is great. But I think that's really good. Just to go back briefly to Larry's comment about not reading the short stories very much. When I first met Jimmy DeVita, the very first rehearsal process I had with him in 1996, I think we've done 14 plays together over the years or something, known each other very well for a long time. But I remember saying something in regard to Moliere about Chekhov. And he bristled, because he was still kind of the Long Island fisherman at that point and proud of not wanting to have anything to do with culture. And in any kind of what he thought of as academic culture. And I said, well, Jimmy, if you don't think Chekhov's plays are great, or, if you haven't read them yet, you should read his short stories. And he said, oh, I don't know. So I said, well, if I gave you one, would you read it? And he said, I guess I probably would. And so I went about a year later and I bought him the entire 14 volumes of Chekhov's short stories and just left him on this front porch. And he just fell in love. You realize how, somebody carries a reputation into your life that you think, oh God, what an egghead, I can't read that stuff. And then you start reading it and you realize, oh, this is about me. And it's just so freeing. It's almost like you wish you could, to sort of wipe out all the previous stuff about any writer and just enter it freshly, like these things do. And yeah, and Mary Pat, that's great. I mean, that's what a good teacher ought to do, is say something that makes you think, oh, wow, I'm going to go back and look at that again. Oh, I see. Because then you start to pick those things up other places too, which is great.
Right. And when Saunders used the story, the example from his own life, again with that story about meeting death and his experience on the airplane, I mean, all of a sudden, and I see people shaking their heads. I mean, I started reading that going, oh, okay, I haven't had that happen to me, thank goodness, but I can certainly relate to that because I've been on planes. And then all of a sudden, all of those paragraphs in the story just kind of fell into place. And I went, oh, okay, I get Vasily.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's hugely valuable. It's just really, because, you know, sometimes you have to look kind of around the words or underneath the words, or, you know, and realize there's something else going on that's speaking to you, that it may not be, you know, it may be a peripheral character in a story that catches your attention, and then that leads you back in and makes you think, well, now why did that character react to that person in that way? Oh, and I would have reacted in that way. You know, I mean, I just think there's so much going on with so many of these stories in just these sort of simple ways. Who else wants to talk about a story or the book, or, I mean, well, yeah, Mary Pat.
No, Adele, I think he meant you.
Oh, okay. I think one of the themes, thanks to Saunders bringing it up and making a point of it, is transformation. My three favorite stories were Master and Man, The Singers, and it was a tie between Gooseberries and Alosha the Pot. And again, the whole thought of energy and transformation, I had to go back and kind of pick out, when did the moment of transition or transformation occur? So I think all those stories, all the stories had that element, you know, in them. So
great. How do you talk a little more about transformation and about what it means to you, or what it?
Well, it was after Master and Man, on page 242, talking about pure new energy, but a redirection of the man that died, the old energy. And I think just that sometimes stories get stuck in a protagonist or the bad guy, and there's just such a rut or a parallel path. And I think in all of these stories, that transformation or that interweaving, even, you know, leaving you in wonderment or making you question, why would someone do that? In the last story with, I'm probably pronouncing this incorrectly, Alosha the Pot, you know, reading that several times and trying to determine about his death and the smile at the end. Not to get too personal, but I was with my mother when she passed away, and she had this, her last sound was one of happiness and astonishment. And I think maybe that's why that story struck me so tenderly, that you don't have to be the best or, you know, the main character to have a happy ending. And I think he lived, in that particular story, he lived sweetly, and he transformed people's expectations that they had of him and changed it all around. So yeah, I really enjoyed all of the stories, for that element.
Yeah, yeah, I was just looking at the area that you were talking about, the peculiar joy, that a joy I associate with his relief at finally shucking off a way of being what has always impeded him. He recognizes this new version of himself, feels that strange and solemn tenderness, and starts to cry.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really something.
Yeah.
Because we don't, events will transform you sometimes.
Yeah.
But you have to let it in order for it to transform you.
That's the secret.
That's an amazing moment with your mother. My gosh. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. It was, it really made me happy. And so she had dementia terribly. And so it was like a little bit of a clear moment, and it was a happy, clear moment.
Wow. Anyone else have a story they want to talk about? Or?
Well, it was not so much the story, but the comment about appreciating the stories because of the moment of transformation that seems to be evident in each one of them. But what struck me about them, about those moments of transformation, was it's not certain that they will be permanent. I guess, and it came up first with in the cart, where there was that momentary, well, it could be lasting, but we don't know, where Maria is reminded of her childhood with the brightness of the train windows. And then and the other theme and I think that's also, well, the other theme about that transformation is that it's always a little bit ambiguous. In her case, we don't know whether it's going to be a lasting change or new understanding. In the singers, they were transformed while they were singing, but then went back into their drunken ways. With Alosha, we don't really know what changed, why he reacted that way. And so I think this whole theme of transformation is there, but it's always with ambiguity. Yeah. And I did like the last story, the pot the best. I think because of that ambiguity at the end, we don't really know what made Alicia react the way he did. And so we're left to our own imagining to try to fill in the blanks. And then also that story was just very, very simple.
Yeah.
So that was my favorite.
Oh, great. And I agree with everything you say. And Saunders' essay about that is fascinating, because you can feel him really trying to struggle with what Tolstoy meant, and then he goes round and round about the story, and you're starting to feel like he really hates this story. And then towards the end, he simply says, I love this story. This is a great, great story. And it just reminds you of that the stories, really good stories, it's not their job to please you all the time. Their job is to provoke you and to get inside you somehow, and to make you think about yourself in relation to the story, and then inverting that yourself in relation to the world. And I think that's what really, really good writing does. Other people want to talk about a story?
I loved all the stories. I guess what I really enjoyed were a lot of just Saunders, like how a writer does what they do. There were a few parts I marked about the structure as a form of call and response. A question arises organically from the story, And then the story very considerately answers it. If you want to make good structure, we just have to be aware of what questions we are causing the reader to ask, and then ask that question, or I'm sorry, then answer that question. And there was another where he said, if a complicated machine showed up in our yard, you wouldn't start altering it and improving it until you had some idea of its intended function. The Hollywood version meant to answer the question, what does this story appear to want to be? And then there's one last part, and this one I really liked. Every story is narrated by someone, and since everyone has a viewpoint, every story is misnarrated. It's narrated subjectively.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really important, is to try to figure out what's
the narrator.
Who is the narrator, and what is he or she, what axis are they grinding, you know, as they tell you the story.
I thought that was, I didn't read them all. I really focused, because of my own preferences, I went to The Nose by Gogol. And the reason that I got to that is because I really got to The Nose through Shostakovich, because he wrote an opera called The Nose, and I don't know if it ever got much produced, and I've been trying to understand Shostakovich, so I really wanted to go find out The Nose so that I can understand Shostakovich more. But to me, I was really astounded because I didn't find a moment of transformation in that. But what I did find was it was so discombobulating, literally, that to me, it helped me understand, because I read 2 or 3 biographies of Shostakovich trying to understand what he really thought. And to me, that gave me an understanding of Shostakovich, even though this story was written 150, 200 years ago.
Right.
Despite The Nose and all that transformation, that guy there was no transformation that I could figure out. It just, it happened, and he went back to being the way he was.
Yeah, I know.
It's how do you understand the world? I mean, there was no moral reason, no moral direction. And I think that's what Shostakovich felt living in Russia and being a composer.
Right. Yeah, I think you're right. Wow. Well, how many of you responded to The Nose strongly in one way or another? I mean, you know, it's so different from any other story in the book. And Gogol was just some of his stuff is so brilliant. And this is an example of that. But yet, you know, but I think Saunders is really onto something when he talks about how we just give into it. You know, we just say, oh yeah, there's the guy talking to his nose. The guy that his nose is dressed up as a, you know, and you don't ask yourself all the questions you ought to ask. It's really
well, I only got that was as far as I got. I got about halfway through The Nose, but I started it because I was reading it this afternoon. And I think part of it is that I love to bake. So I do a lot of baking. And I'm reading, and I mean, I know the story's called The Nose, and his wife is baking bread, and I'm imagining baking bread, and oh, there's something in the bread. Well, I'm running, you know, my brain is doing this split-second calculation of, oh my gosh, it's a clump of baking soda that didn't get, you know, all mixed in, or maybe butter. Yeah, but butter still wouldn't be hard. I mean, I had maybe a half a dozen what to me were logical explanations that were in my head before I read Nose. And I was stopped in my tracks. And it took me about a minute to go, and now what's a nose doing in here? I mean, it was just the oddest thing. But then I was hooked because, you know, why is this nose here? And what's he going to do with it?
Yeah.
It reminded me of reading Kafka's Metamorphosis for the first time, where that was like, how can this guy be turning into a bug? And how can this guy not have a nose? And I wondered if Kafka was influenced by the nose, because it was like 80 years later.
Right.
But I thought it was very funny.
I think apart from the funniness, what really amazed me is it drove me to reading more about the Russian aristocracy, because they kept talking when they were talking about the classes and the ranks of these individuals, so that you had the collegiate assessor. And I said, what is a collegiate assessor? And so you wanted to go down and figure that out. So you hadn't realized that under Peter the Great, they started having these classifications, and Peter the Great specified that they would have specific uniforms. So we're now into 50, this being written 50 years into that change by Peter the Great. And everyone's running around. You can see, anyone you see on the street, they're wearing a uniform, you know what they're about. So you can tell their rank in society by that. So the nose, to me, once I read that, I'm seeing the story that allows him to poke fun at this whole rank and uniform and the people that were in it, because only 1% of the Russians were part of that upper class that did that. So it was a very small percentage of people.
Right. Well, and what's the very end of it? It's
I'm turning it off.
Where he buys the ribbon for himself, even though they say that he hadn't done anything. He buys himself one more ribbon, and and every time he interacts with somebody, he either brings up the name of one of these women that he knows who are, of a certain class, and he's furious with his nose because his nose is masquerading as at a class higher than himself, which allows the nose to treat him with disdain when he sees him on the street. It's just riddled with class. You're right. I mean, it really is. I mean, if you talk about these as being quietly subversive stories, that's Gogol basically saying, hey, wake up. What is all of this stuff where we're ranking people in these tiny gradations, and what puts you above me and me above him, and all of the ways that the repercussions of that move back and forth through society. Steph, did you want to say something? Your box is lit. It's like Hollywood Squares. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to mention that Nancy had suggested the audiobook version on Libro, and if you get a chance to listen to the nose, what is his name, Nancy? Dwight from The Office reads it, and it's hysterically and so well done.
Oh, great.
Yeah, Rainn Wilson.
Yeah.
Nick Offerman.
Yeah, really good.
The singers.
But I did want to mention too, just generally, I didn't finish either. I'm almost done, but
right, you're all going to make F tonight. I'm sorry. I mean, the point is, you're supposed to finish these books. You don't just carry along with you. Okay.
Finish it. I just haven't finished it yet. I think one of the things that really struck me with the stories I did get through, and I got through the notes, was just the emotional complexity. I haven't read a lot of the Russian short stories, and just how things can be like extraordinary and ordinary all at the same time, and hopeful and like devastatingly sad all at the same time. And it's just, the emotional complexity was so moving and wonderful. So thank you for introducing me to this.
Oh, good. Yeah. There's frequently a stage direction in Chekhov's plays that's two words, and it just says through tears. And it doesn't mean that the person is crying necessarily. In fact, it frequently means that it isn't, because sometimes the character's laughing. But it's Chekhov's way of saying the basis of whatever you're saying comes out of a sadness. However it comes out of your mouth is a whole different, a different oral experience, A-U-R-A-L, or however the hell you spell that. But yeah, I think that is, the Russians are famous for these abrupt changes. And it makes their writing, but the nose is a great example of, it just seems that everybody's just kind of okay that this guy's nose is missing, and You know, when he finally shows the clerk, you know, that his nose is missing, and the clerk says, "Oh yeah, it's as flat as a pancake." You know, and he doesn't seem to be upset about it. I mean, you know, if someone walked into Arcadia Books and walked up to Nancy and removed a handkerchief and there was no nose there and it was just flat as, I mean, you know, what would you do, Nancy? Well, that's not a fair question, but you know, it's.
Well, and I think my favorite part of that story was when the doctor comes and he's just like, "You're better off without it."
Yeah.
Like, just doesn't even want to attempt to put it back on. Just things like that. It was so absurd and wonderful. Yeah.
Let me ask you. Let me go back to the very first story, Chekhov's In the Cart. And what did you think about Saunders's way of studying that story by going a page at a time?
It felt tedious at first, especially since it was the introduction to the book. But for some reason, I didn't mind it. I mean, when he first said we're going to go page by page, oh my goodness. And then, you know, you're reading about the first, couple of pages. But I think because he broke it down so well and it felt almost like a little short masterclass in short story writing, as opposed to just analysis of the story. I didn't mind it. And I really appreciated it. And when I got to the end, I thought, well, I don't want to write a short story, but I think if I did want to, it would be really hard rather than, you know, oh, I'm going to write a short story. Look at all the people that do it. So it was very helpful for me.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about it is that at a certain point in that analysis, he says, it's about this time when my students start to rebel. I mean, that they can't take it anymore. You know, can we just finish the damn story? But I found it really, really fascinating to try to be that disciplined. I happen to be married to a woman who basically reads the end of any book she takes on before she reads the rest of it, because she wants to make sure that things are okay, because she doesn't like, sad things. And when she told me that and it's a good thing she told me that she read Atonement that way, early in the relationship when there wasn't a lot of weight between. Otherwise, I think I just would have left her immediately. If we'd been married and she told me that she read the end of Atonement before she read the rest of the book, I just would have thought, there's no way I can be with this person. But it's just, there's something about, taking a story and going that slowly with it. And having, because I knew the story pretty well, but I found it very potent to stop and think really hard about what had just happened before I went on to the next page. Allison, are you about to say something? Were you? Oh, no, you're muted. You can't be. Oh, you aren't.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I especially like that page by page approach because it was like we were getting to experience the process of the story unfolding, led by a really wonderful, masterly guide. I mean, in general, I appreciated, to me, it's always so much more interesting to hear writers talk about the process than to hear critics talk about it, because writers talk about it from the inside, and he goes inside that story and just slows us way down. So we kind of experience it. I don't know. I just experience it in a different kind of way. I read really quickly, so I tend to dash through things without intending to. And it was a good reminder right at the beginning to just, experience the story the way it was written, word by word. So yeah. For what it's worth.
Yeah, that's the speed that you read at, I think, really matters.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I happen to read fairly slowly for someone who's always loved to read and someone who reads huge amount. I don't read very quickly, and I'm an inveterate, well, I'll give you an example. I'm an inveterate note taker in so that it drives me mad if I have to read on a Kindle, because I just, then I have to scribble on a piece of pad of paper and then line it up somehow when I'm going to write about it or something. But yeah, I find that these stories, either the story itself or Saunders in the way that he talks about it and the way his students talk about them, they just remind you to go slowly. That if you really want to take in even writing that seems simple, the way to do it is to slow yourself down, listen really carefully, and then I just think you'll appreciate more. I mean, because we all get lost in things and we have to go back and go, wait, who's that again? And of course the big Russian novels are famous for those. That's why most of them are published with cast lists. But, but I just think this is a really good example of why trying to slow yourself down to read is a hugely valuable idea, hugely valuable lesson. Did anybody else like or dislike that idea of reading something a page at a time? Or have you ever tried it yourself? I mean, it made me think, well, I'm going to start every now and then. I'm going to read something that way.
I fell into the group of his students that were ready to rebel. I just said, let's get on with this. And I just said, I was upset. I said, let me read the story and then let's talk about it. But
he was very upset. I wasn't sure he was continuing. I was ahead though, and so I reassured him. Well, he lets you go 2 pages at a time.
Yeah, pretty soon you get to read 2. Whoa! Really?
And once I made it into the second story, then I understood why he did it. But I was not one to accept his method with quietly.
I think that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of how I felt too. I was annoyed with it at first. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, I hope he's not going to do this through the entire book because I'll never make it through. But I did understand, the purpose of that once I got to, and I have to admit, I didn't finish the book either, but, and I skipped around, but I thought it was a really good way to introduce how to look at the rest of the stories. And I generally have not been a big fan of Russian literature because I find it so depressing. But I thought this was really a good experience for me to kind of open it up and make me look at it a different way.
Oh, well, that's great. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
I'm sorry.
I was going to say, oh, sorry.
No.
Okay.
I did the audiobook. I actually bought it and then ran out of time to read it. And now I think I want to reread it in writing. But what really blew me away was at the end of the audiobook, when it's the end, I thought, what else are they going to have left to discuss? Because there was still some time left in the presentation. And they actually did a read through of the cart in full without any interruptions. And having that experience after going through the first story page by page and then the entire book really blew me away. I found it, I don't think I would have enjoyed that story as much if all of the stuff that came before it had not happened, including going page by page with the cart.
Oh, that's great. Genevieve, your lighting, it looks like you're telling a ghost story. It's just
sorry.
Your face is illuminated and there's nothing else. It's just this.
Sorry.
You and Larry are on the same planet that this is today, but it's, yeah, okay.
James, may I make, I was just going to make a comment about the, back to you were talking about slowing yourself down, which I tend to read. I'll start out trying to read too fast. And then depending on the book, like a book like this, I have to go, oh no, I can't just, blow through this. But what I think one of my big takeaways was, just because it's a short story doesn't mean that it's going to be short. I mean, some of these short stories by the Russians, they feel like they take as long to read as, say, a short novel. And it's not that it's a negative of the story, but there's just so much compressed into it that, you know, I kind of had to go, okay, treat this, if the story may only be 10 pages long, but treat it like you're reading a novel.
Uh-huh. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Wow.
I think that's why I liked the page by page, because I liked how he talked about how, you know, these characters have to earn their spot in the cart, and why are they there? It can't be just any peasant. It has to be this one that's going to move the story along. And I think it's also interesting that, you know, Tolstoy can write a short story, and then he can write War and Peace. You know, I mean, with the short story, you've got a few pages, you have to put as much as you can in and make the story full, and just choose your words so wisely. Like James, your favorite parenthetical, your picnic, comma, lightning, you know, that it tells you the whole story. So, you know, when you choose the right words, you can tell the whole story quickly.
Right. Yeah.
I was just going to mention that what I loved about this, and I'm a great fan of Saunders and not a big fan of Russian lit, but I felt like I had the profound privilege of being in his classroom and being one of his students, and having him walk me through, you know, a story and deconstruct it. And I found that incredible, and it was as moving about the characters in the story, but also said a lot about Saunders himself and what profound humanity he has and recognizes in these stories. And I found that a real joy. Also, it's real clear. I think most of us know that he's a practitioner of Buddhism and meditation. And it's so clear that this slowing down is part of his offering, his gift to us of slowing down ourselves and paying attention to what the writer's doing.
You know,
since we're talking about Saunders, one of the things that I really appreciated in his writing was how he was talking about great literature, and you could tell he had his academic chops in terms of language, but he would just go very colloquial and very common and very, he made it all very reachable for anybody. And I like Russian literature and I like Saunders, so this all worked well. But I hadn't appreciated the short stories, and his insights into the reading. I'm reading other books as well for maybe less good books for our book clubs that I'm in. They aren't tight. They aren't. Each character seems a little random to me now after hearing Saunders examine so carefully each scene, each statement, each character. I find myself a little impatient. As a matter of fact, two books I started and said, not worth my time, and didn't read them. And that's unusual for me. Usually if I start and it's a book club and I'm supposed to do it, I do it. But these were like unworthy after what Saunders was talking about in terms of writing. And so I feel like it was, it's a demanding book. This book, very demanding, but very worth it to kind of open your eyes to what really, really good writing looks like. So,
great. Yeah, I think you're really on to something important, Kate, in the sense of his generosity, you know, and his ability to not intimidate, you know, to just bring it in so that everyone can understand and grasp what Saunders thinks might be going on. And he always, I mean, I love at the very end when he says, you know, if you don't agree with me, that's great. That's because that just means your own inner life is starting to push back. And that's a really useful thing too. Because I've always loved, you know, I've done most of Chekhov's plays either as an actor or director, mostly as director, but I love the way that most of these writers do use humor in such odd ways. I mean, in Chekhov's play Uncle Vanya, there's all this crazy stuff happens. And then the two people that have created all this disruption in the lives of this family leave about 2/3 of the way through the last act. And you hear their troika going away and you know they've left. And then over the space of 2.5 pages, Chekhov brings 4 people on stage and they say exactly the same 2 words. They've gone. And by the time the 4th person says it, you're nearly wetting your pants. You're laughing so hard because you think if one more person comes in and tells me that they're gone, you know, it's such sly humor. And it's because everybody's kind of doing their job. And it just makes you just ache with laughter and also ache for these sad people because they've just had this crazy crap happen in their lives. And yet, you know, they're right back to sort of reordering themselves and putting things back together. And that's part of it, is announcing that Hannah, stop, that the people left. Someone else talk while I control my door.
I was just going to say that I enjoy Tolstoy's novels, but I was frustrated with his stories, with both the master and the father in the pot story, and maybe because I'm involved too much in politics, but they both reminded me of Donald Trump and the income equity issue that's, you know, it's just been in the news during the pandemic. The top 1% made more money than anybody else in the history of the world. And it's like, these stories were written such a long time ago, and we really haven't advanced very far from that. So I wanted the peasant who the master saved to have some bigger insight. I wanted Alosha to rebel against his father, and, you know, he finally discovered love. And I agreed with Saunders about, come on, stand up, do something. So that was a frustration, but it was an enjoyable frustration.
Yeah, well, that's good. It's the enjoyable part that I think matters. I know, and because it is, I mean, I think it's great to struggle with a story. I remember, you know, I've read plenty of books that I just threw across the room. I'd be so angry with something was going on, but I you know, it doesn't mean I don't want to finish it. It's just, yeah. You know, I think most of you know that one of my favorite writers is William Maxwell, and there's been 3 wonderful books of his letters back and forth. And in one of his letters to Sylvia Townsend Warner, he has a little PS where they're talking about islands. And he says, you know, in my next life, if I can't be an island, then I want to be Gooseberries by Anton Chekhov. So he actually wants to just live in the story, Gooseberries. And I thought, God, what a wonderful thing to say about some other writer's story. It's just too much. Any other, we're almost at the end here. Is there any other general comment or specific comment that anybody wants to add?
If I could just add one thing. As I started reading this book, I really loved Saunders. I loved all of his takes on the stories. They were wonderful. But there are a few things that I wished he would have said in chapter 1 rather than at the end of the book. Those of you who haven't finished it, make sure you finish it and get right to the end, because I thought he dismissed at the beginning the translations. He just said, oh, I just am reading the one that I usually read. And I thought, wow, when you're reading a work in translation, and he illustrates it at the end, why that is so important to address the translation. And he didn't do it at the beginning. And the other thing I wished he would have done more strongly at the beginning and throughout is according to George. At the end, he says he tells his students in week 1 of the class, put a little parentheses according to George after everything I say, because you can feel free to disagree. And way back with the first story, the cart, I remember on one of the, we're doing it page by page, and one of the pages, George said, well, look, now Hanov has gone away. And so now Chekhov has closed the door to that. He's not coming back. And I thought, what do you mean? He can come back. I mean, I don't get that. So I couldn't, I found myself disagreeing with him and then thinking, who am I to disagree with George Saunders? I mean, that I didn't have the right to disagree with him. But at the end, he gives you the right. So in a way, I wished he would have taken that. Well, no, I don't wish that. It ended beautifully. It was really a wonderful work, but I did wish he would have addressed the translation issue sooner.
Yeah, because I skipped around. I loved that part too about the translation. I skipped around, so I did read that, even though I hadn't read part of the middle of the book. And I found that absolutely fascinating, the way he was showing the different ways. And they really were, really changed the meaning a lot for me.
Yeah.
And now I'm always going to be thinking about that when I'm reading something that's in translation, how maybe you'd have to read a couple different translations of things.
Yeah, I think you should. You should. If you really love a story and you find a section of it that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to you, you should find another translation and read it. There's a very famous story, which this will be the end of it, but a famous story of, there was a production of Chekhov's play, The Cherry Orchard, at Lincoln Center in 1976, and it was translated by Jean-Claude Van Italy, who was a very good translator of Chekhov. And there's a famous speech in the last act where the mother of the house is giving up the house. She has to leave, and Irene Worth was playing the role. And she was doing this long speech while she was circling the huge stage at Lincoln Center. And she kept bumping up on this one word in the script. And she finally stopped after the third or fourth run through of the scene. And she looked out into the stalls and she said, Jean-Claude, could you give me a different word here? The word you've given me is a 2-syllable word, and I just think it needs 3 syllables just for the rhythm. And he looked at the original Russian, and the word in the Russian was 3 syllables. And he translated it as a 2-syllable word. And so, I mean, when you're really hearing the music, that really matters. And so, yeah, a translation really matters a lot. And I agree. I was surprised, Mary, that he didn't talk about because he doesn't even mention the translators till the end of the book. I mean, it doesn't even give their names. I thought that was really kind of weird. But yeah, when he does start talking about the different translations, it's really, really interesting. And it's very useful. Okay, I guess that's it. Oops, we're 1 minute over.
Not yet, because we have to talk about next month.
Oh, right. Well, I have to be honest. I was going to do a different book, and that's when I was being coy last month. A book that I really admire, but I just decided, which is a book called We Run the Tides by Vendela Vida. But it's about 13-year-old girls in San Francisco in 1984. And I thought, well, but I urge you all, I mean, it's a really, really good book. Very, very powerful and funny. And the young lady who is the narrator, Eulaby, is just one of the great characters of the year. But then I read this, and which I had been waiting to read. And it's just too good not to talk about. Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro, his newest book, his first book since he won the Nobel Prize in 2017. And it's quite a remarkable book. And it's, you know, like all of his books, it's very, it's quiet. He lets you kind of slowly understand things. One of the things I've always admired about him is that he doesn't set the scene for you. You just kind of experience what the characters are experiencing, and slowly you figure out where you are, what the time frame is. You know, it's just it's a really truly beautiful book. So that's what we're going to read for next month. And what's the date of that, Nancy?
That would be April 21st at 6 p.m.
Okay, April 21st. Clara and the Sun. Okay. By the way, I just noticed I saw a picture of the cover in the English version is much prettier than the American version. Huh, I wonder why they did that. Okay, any other things, anything anybody needs to say, wants to say?
I just wanted to mention, if you guys haven't listened to the Ezra Klein interview, the podcast in the New York Times with George Saunders, it's really wonderful. It's just a gloss on what everything we said.
Oh, great.
Should be available.
Great, good.
Could you, James, could you tell us one more time the name of the book you rejected for this, April?
Oh, We Run the Tides. I didn't reject it. I just thought, maybe it's a little too species specific or something. I don't know. But yeah, We Run the Tides by Vendela Vida, V-I-D-A. It's a novel that you can read it quite quickly. She's actually married to Dave Eggers. And this is about her 6th book, and it's really good. Natalie read it. Did you read it, Nancy?
I haven't yet.
Yeah, Natalie read it and just loved it. So, and you know, if you've had a daughter, or if you have a daughter, and you know, you grew up with a daughter or a sister, I think it's a book that'll speak to you. So.
James wrote about this in today's newsletter, and a few weeks ago about We Run the Tides. So you can check those past editions on our website if you'd like.
Okay, thank you all. That was great. That really, there was a lot of good stuff. So appreciate it.
Okay, thanks everybody. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.